Okay, this is our chapter 12, section 2 presentation on business cycles. Hopefully this is mostly review. Business cycle is macroeconomics. I'm going to stress macroeconomics. Expansion followed by contraction. So you got this nice graph here. It's going to expand, then contract, expand, contract, and it should hopefully rise up like that. Macroeconomics, so it's not microeconomics. It's not going to be locally in your town. It's going to be your country or business, something big. You know, your macro versus microeconomics. When you look at your business cycle, you have 4 phases. You got your expansion, which is your growth. You got plenty of jobs and low employment. So that would be this section. Then your peak is when your real GDP stops rising, just reaches a peak, stops rising, and then it will follow by contraction, which is basically the opposite of expansion. Economic decline, falling output, rising unemployment, and then you got your trough, which is the end of your contraction, and you go back to expansion. So it just follows that cycle, hopefully. In your book, it says there's 3 types of contractions. It doesn't say anything about expansion, different types of expansion, but I guess that makes sense because how do you really characterize expansion? 3 types of contraction are your recession, depression, and stagflation. A recession, I'm not going to ask you about the exact time period of this, but if you want to know, it's the GDP falls 2 consecutive quarters, at least 6 straight months, generally lasting 6 to 18 months, and then unemployment is 6 to 10%. And then a depression is just a severe recession of high employment and low economic output. In this cartoon I put here, it says, it's a quote by Harry Truman that they put in the cartoon. It says the recession is when your neighbor loses his job, but depression is when you lose your job. So if you remember that, probably on the quiz, it's just a recession, difference between recession and depression, which is worse, which is obviously depression. And the stagflation has the unique characteristic of inflation, rising in price level, so prices rise as the GDP falls. So in this comic, it says stagflation, silver lining. A guy who has to commute to work, he still has his job. He says, man, these real costs are killing me. And the other guy says, at least I don't have to worry about to commute to work and stuff. So stagflation, it's kind of a double whammy. As the GDP falls, you might lose your job, but if you keep your job, you have to deal with the inflation and higher prices. So remember inflation and stagflation, which I mean it has part of the word in it, so that should not be too hard. There are 4 variables in business cycles that I guess people study economics and all this say affect your business cycles. I put them on this presentation. The first one is business investment. If economy is good, businesses are investing and growing their companies. This furthers economic growth, and you got your expansion. When a company says, hey, we need to stop growing, or demand, like they've expanded beyond their demand, right? They're producing more, they have a higher supply than the demand. Again, introduction into supply and demand. Remember that. I mean, you can apply that to most all economics, supply and demand. As demand drops, they've reached their peak, and they have to stop investing, and they might even have to lay off people, cut production or stuff, and then you have your contraction, and drop in spending by businesses leads to drop in spending by workers, which leads to recession, to contraction. So I put here business spending would be like uh, workers. Okay. Third business cycle variable is consumer expectations, which I think is pretty interesting. Just the consumer thinking that something's gonna happen will affect the economy and the business cycle. And it kind of ties into external shocks, which I'll talk about. If a consumer thinks that, hey, there's gonna be a war pretty soon that's gonna affect our economy, and they stop spending, then it's actually, and a whole bunch of consumers think this way, then the economy is actually gonna drop because they're not spending money that will go to businesses that will grow the economy, right? Same thing happens the opposite way. If the consumer thinks that something, that a business is gonna grow, that the economy is gonna grow, they're gonna spend money more freely, and that's gonna help businesses grow, and which will help the economy grow. So I thought that was interesting, that just thinking some way will help the economy. And then the hardest to predict of all of these variables is the external shocks, which makes sense because they're outside of kind of our thinking. You got wars, droughts, oil supply, basically anything that you cannot predict will happen. Wars, droughts, and oil supply disruptions like by OPEC, which I'll talk about later, would obviously harm us. That's why I put them in red. And then external shocks that would help you if you discovered natural resources in a country, like in the US, or, gold rush. And then good weather during growing seasons. You can't really predict the weather 100% accurately. If you have good weather, grow a lot of crops, that's external shock that's gonna help you. Forecasting the business cycle. Like I've talked about, forecasting of a business cycle, just like weather forecasting, you can't do it 100% because you have so many factors leading into it, and that's basically what keeps business interesting. Correctly forecasting businesses cycles is important because it leads to success of the business. The more accurate you are in predicting a business or predicting what's going to happen in the economy, the more successful you're going to be. There's just nothing else to really add. Just like in a day, if you could accurately predict the weather and put on the right clothes, you're going to be more successful in that day. Leading indicators, which is just some tools that people use in predicting business cycles and growth and contraction of the economy, the stock market, obviously, and then interest rates, which we talked about as one of the variables. Conference Board, it mentions in your book, is a private business that has an index of 10 leading economic indicators. I didn't look up what those are. Basically, they analyze all the variables and stuff, and they try to say, is our economy going to grow? Is it going to shrink? When they talk about the Great Depression, they say before it happened, the stock market hit a record low and all that. So you can definitely use the stock market to predict if the economy is going to drop or contract. So the rest of the chapter is about the history of business cycles. I'll just go through it quickly. 1929, you got your stock market crash, and the U.S. was in a recession that most thought would bounce back by itself. Right, stock market was a recession. However, it continued, and GDP fell by a quarter, and 1 out of 4 workers was jobless. So that, if you go back to our difference between recession and depression, the unemployment would be at a quarter, right? 25%. So that's definitely way more than a recession. So that's why it's called the Great Depression, because it's very high employment. John Maynard Keynes, is that correct? Keynesian, right? Yeah. Okay, Keynesian economics. General theory of unemployment, interest, and money. he came into play during the Great Depression and basically said the government needs to spend money and to bring us out of this depression. He also said that the modern market would have long-lasting contractions, and that the government intervention was needed. So it's pretty important economic dude. I have a graph here. If you can see this section right here, it's kind of hard to see. That's the Depression, and then up here is World War II, which ultimately got us out of it, and then it follows up. 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected, and you obviously learned about him in American History with Ganser, and all the organizations he put together. I put this comic in. This is supposed to be the United States representation. All these medicines are his organizations, and this is Delano Roosevelt acting as a doctor. So that would be an example of government spending. All these organizations that he put together were funded by the government, giving money to the people. Hopefully that would help. It helped a little, but ultimately what brought us out of the Great Depression? World War II. 1970s, so we're gonna jump from 1930s to 1970s. The OPEC organization of petroleum exporting countries was put together, and they come together and say they figure out the prices that will benefit them the most. So they stopped producing a ton of oil, and that drove prices really high. Well, that led to a stagflation in our economy because we get most of our oil from them. If you want to know, those are the countries: Venezuela, your Middle East, some African countries. So during this stagflation, the U.S. economy United States started finding more efficient ways to heat our homes, transportation and stuff. And when OPEC realized, hey, they're finding new ways to do this, they started producing more oil, and that lowered its prices, so we started buying more, and that ended stagflation, but it was also good for OPEC because they could control the oil prices just based on how much they supplied. 1980s, we have the high interest rates. So they had high interest rates in the 1980s, plus other factors that led to a fall in the real GDP. Unemployment was at 9% plus. So, I mean, you could consider that a recession since it's 9%, but if it went a little higher, I would consider it depression. I think it'd be a recession. 1990s, we got the investment in bad technology, so a lot of companies are coming out with their own version of technology and computers and stuff, and there's so much competition and stuff that people are investing. They don't know what's gonna succeed, what's gonna fail. Well, investing in the ones that would fail led to a recession in 2001, and then in September 11, 2001, 9/11, consumers dropped significantly in tourism because of the terrorist attack. So that led to another contraction in U.S. history. And then the most recent one, I guess, is 2003. We had a GDP grew to 7.5% in 3 months, but then high gas prices led to another slowing economy, and then 2008 mortgage crisis led to recession in 2008, which I'm sure you've heard of. So that's your lesson on business cycles.